We're fine. So as you can see, hopefully from the title slide, I'm going to be talking about Towers of Joy to Sick Room Gardens, revisiting Dorothy Wordsworth's dwelling places of the mind. So this talk's going to take a short wander through, bear with the puns, through some places as Dorothy experienced them. I hope we're going to end up at a point where we can sit down, maybe in the shelter of a dry stone wall, and consider two views at once, internal and external. We'll look at these overlaid landscapes of the mind and the earth, and the parallels we can see between her acute sensory experience of material place and her ability to conjure places from or in her imagination, both remembered and created. Since we're circling local thinking, I'm encouraging us all to revisit what local can be, traveling through various resonances, from its earliest usage in English as a medical term meaning positioned in a particular part of the body, to all the senses of regionality, dwelling, and belonging we've come to associate with it. It's a lot of ground to cover in 20 minutes, so some of this might not be much more than a haze in the distance. Throughout, we will be overlooked by the twin points of embeddedness and embodiedness as we turn back to places whose material reality rests inside the body-mind, or for which the body, located in one place, becomes a portal to all and any others, offering a way out of the limits of corporeal reality. We're going to begin our wander just up the road here in Grasmere, in the wood Dorothy and William named for their brother John, John's Grove. On April 29th, 1802, Dorothy sits and listens and watches in three different places: in the wood, in a trench on the ground in the wood, and on grass under a wall. Each time a kind of quiet, slow observation expands what she notices, which she later records in her journal. We then went to John's Grove, sat a while at first. Afterwards, William lay and I lay in the trench under the fence, he with his eyes shut and listening to the waterfalls and the birds. There was no one waterfall above another. It was a sound of waters in the air, the voice of the air. William heard me breathing and rustling now and then, but we both lay still and unseen by one another. He thought it would be as sweet thus to lie so in the grave, to hear the peaceful sounds of the earth and just to know that one's dear friends were near. The lake was still, there was a boat out, silver how reflected with delicate purple and yellowish hues as I have seen spar, lambs on the island and running races together by the half-dozen in the ground field near us. The copses green-ish, hawthorn green. Came home to dinner, then went to Mr. Simpson's. We rested a long time under a wall. Sheep and lambs were in the field, cottages smoking. As I lay down on the grass, I observed the glittering silver line on the ridges of the backs of the sheep, owing to their situation respecting the sun, which made them look beautiful, but with something of strangeness, like animals of another kind, belonging to a more splendid world. So this is one of my favorite episodes of the journal, and this alone I could talk about for at least 20 minutes. But for our purposes today, it's salient to notice how being literally embedded in a place and really noticing what there is there with all of the senses always becomes for both siblings a way of slipping into other places too. So deep engagement with one location enables the body-mind to become a device for entering another, which is a Wordsworthian trope, I think, for both siblings. With that in sight, we're going to move on to our second location, which is the sick room. This is light in Dorothy's bedroom a couple of Decembers ago. In 1832, Dorothy begins to make a collection of poems within her commonplace book, her daily notebook, which she calls Sickbed Consolations. These sickbed consolations were begun at a time when Dorothy had been ill, on and off, for over 2 years, but did not imagine that she would be ill for the rest of her life. She saw her life in the sick room as a temporary disruption, not a permanent one. It was something she had to be patient through and learn from. The poems reflect her hopes for the future, for recovery, but more than anything, they show her attempts to work out how to live with her new reality. It's a struggle shared by anyone with an acquired disability and by many people with lifelong illnesses as their condition changes over time. The poems she writes are a solace and a comfort in themselves, but also reach towards pleasure, joy, mitigation of grief and pain. There are three main things that bring Dorothy consolation in her illness: nature, memory, and poetry, and they get entirely tangled up in each other. So writing and reciting poetry becomes both a way of reigniting memories and bringing the natural world into her mind and her room, even when she cannot leave her bed, a way of shifting location. Her greatest consolation is to be out in the fresh air amongst other living things. But when she cannot be physically outside, she brings the outside things, plants and creatures particularly, into the sick room and also into her mind. This happens literally in the location of the room and in memory and imagination. Her poetry brings all of that together as it repeats and performs this enfolding or unfolding of location. The way Dorothy negotiates consolation, a soothing, not a healing, a coming together of distant places and times to bring enjoyment into a painful and dark time, is very instructive to me. It also echoes a lot of contemporary writing by disabled and chronically ill writers. In spring 1832, Dorothy's niece Dora relates the difference Dorothy found in her second winter of sickness versus her first. In the first winter, as Dora explains, Dorothy had said that even during all her suffering, her mind was so active that it was truly a mansion for all lovely forms, and her memory was a dwelling place for all sweet sounds and harmonies. Dorothy's quoting William's Tintern Abbey poem to explain her state of mind. There's a kind of prayer in that poem that William built into it over 30 years earlier when he imagined Dorothy and her mature after years, as he put them. When thy mind shall be a mansion for all lovely forms, thy memory be as a dwelling place for all sweet sounds and harmonies. Oh, then, if solitude or fear or pain or grief should be thy portion, with what healing thoughts of tender joy wilt thou remember me, and these my exhortations. These ideas are revised and revisited in the first of Dorothy's sickbed consolations, Thoughts on My Sickbed, written in May 1832. This becomes a foundational text that her other consolation poems sample from, expand on, and argue with, returning to questions around confinement, location, freedom, and imaginative travel. Both poetry and place often become portals in William's work, and we can see Dorothy using poetry and nature in a similar way here. The poem both records the unlocking of a route back or out into other places, and in the writing of it becomes a kind of key to reopening that door. It's important that in Dorothy's poem, the original key is flowers brought into her room, culled from the precincts of our home, from nooks to memory dear. They're already auratic objects, imbued with memory and emotion. Bringing them into her room is what allows her to travel beyond it, in her mind at least. They're brought to her with love. Writing this act into a poem makes the poem a secondary key. The poem perpetually reenacts the revelation of her hidden life to her consciousness, so that repeating it, reciting it, editing it, working on it, copying it out for friends, each of these acts reopens that door or recreates the conditions of unbodily travel or travel through and out of the body. It's also revising William's youthful notions of how that relationship between nature, memory, and the self might work. In Tintern Abbey, William calls himself a worshipper of nature, whereas Dorothy's poem calls the young siblings companions of nature. William's poem is a poem of an able-bodied 28-year-old. When he imagines nature helping his sister overcome solitude or fear or pain or grief in the future, it is with the best intentions, but with little knowledge of extended, relentless, overwhelming physical pain of the kind she would live with. In the lonely rooms he has, at that time in his life, inhabited, in which remembered nature has lifted the heavy and weary weight of all this unintelligible world, they're not equivalent to the confinement of the sick room Dorothy will experience in her maturity. Thoughts on My Sickbed begins with an and, as though mid-thought, mid-argument, and has the remnant of my life been pilfered of this sunny spring. She is shut indoors, unable to enjoy it. The same language of imprisonment and release appears in her Lines for Dora H., written in June 1835, in the early stages of her recovery from her third great health crisis. She explains, "My failing strength, my tottering limbs, into a prison change this room." These lines in particular are repeated and repeated in fragmentary drafts in her journals at that time. In this poem, too, she attempts to turn the prison of the sick room in verse into a sanctuary. Though it is not a cheerless spot, a cell of sorrow or of gloom, no damp, cold walls enclose it round, no heavy hinges' grating sound disturb the silence and the calm. She knows her room is not a prison, although at times it might feel like it. In March 1834, she describes the weather as provokingly fine, and herself a poor prisoner who cannot stir out beyond the garden. She wants to find the best in her situation, adding, "It's a blessing enough for me to look on it." When she's well enough to write, she is well enough to think herself into thinking herself lucky. But she wavers between these two realities. The room is a prison, it is not a prison. She is free in her mind, able to exit her room through the portal of her body-mind, or she is trapped in her mind, in her body. This too is echoed in the writing of contemporary disabled artists, such as Letty McHugh, who writes about the illness place you go to when you need to send your mind as far away from your body as you can, the farthest edge of a universe that is always expanding, part of a vast multiverse entered through the sick body. So, our third location is the body-mind, a gateway to all other places and times. In the drafts of Thoughts on My Sickbed, some of which you've just seen, Dorothy moves between describing herself as a prisoner in this quiet room to a prisoner in this lonely room to imprisoned in this lonely room, ending up with no prisoner in this lonely room. In Lines for Dora H., it's the window that turns the prison into a sanctuary. The open window allows free entrance of the summer breeze into the room and lets her look out onto the leafy trees, the sky, the clouds, the gleaming showers, crags, lakes, and odoriferous flowers. She may not be able to reach them, but they are still in some way with her, just as her friends and loved ones are in faithful recollection. But the great power in Thoughts on My Sickbed seems to be waning. She does still need the breeze. She needs to see the landscapes. She still feels nature's gifts, but she needs to experience them with her bodily self, not just in thought. She needs external stimulation. The mansions of the mind and the dwelling place of memory are no longer enough. She is trying so hard in these poems to find something good in her situation, to not feel sorry for herself. She's trying to find the moral in the riddle of her own life. In drafts of Thoughts on My Sickbed, she writes of feelings kept down and repressed by exuberant health and thoughts, of blessings strengthening as the body decays. She explores the idea that illness has released something in her, something pushed aside by her busy restlessness in years gone by. This disappears from the neat copy, but lingers in the idea that the bliss she feels when the flowers are brought to her is greater than anything else she has felt before. This echoes an idea in her earlier poem, Irregular Verses, written in 1827. The saddest heart feels deepest gladness. She wants to find not only consolation, but gifts in her sick room. So William's prayer in Tinton Abbey, I think, must have felt at times like a fairy tale gift that became a curse, something promised in one light that takes on a very different significance when it comes to pass. It's no wonder all of her poems are in conversation with it. But they also relate to her earliest surviving writings, letters to her school friend Jane Pollard sent during her teenage years, written through terrible loneliness and uncertainty when she was living at Penrith with her grandparents, and later from her aunt and uncles in Fawncett in Norfolk. In those letters, Dorothy speaks not only of the mansions of the mind, but dream cottages that could be a real home for siblings with few funds. In the first of these letters, here dated, oh, this isn't the first one, sorry. In the first of these letters, dated July 1787, Dorothy writes that every conversation with her brothers ends with wishing we had a father and a home. That December, as she details all of her hopes of visits and meetings to Jane, she asks, "Do you ever build castles?" The castles she means are castles in the air, daydreams, plans she knows unlikely to come to fruition, but poses herself not as a dreamer or a planner even, but a very skillful architect, writing, "I have so many different plans for building one castle, so many contrivances." For Dorothy, her plans are always spatial, local, entirely contingent on the places that would facilitate the events or ways of living she dreams of. She imagines herself as part of Jane's household, Jane as part of hers. In 1793, she writes to Jane of romantic dreams she uses to amuse my fancy during many an hour which would otherwise pass heavily along, in which she tends a parsonage for William. So this is this extract here. "I look with full confidence to the happiness of receiving you in my little parsonage. I hope you will spend at least a year with me. I've laid the particular scheme of happiness for each season. When I think of winter, I hasten to furnish our little parlour. I close the shutters, set out the tea table, brighten the fire. When our refreshment is ended, I produce our work, and William brings his book to our table, and contributes at once to our instruction and amusement. And at intervals we lay aside the book, and each hazard our observations upon what has been read without the fear of ridicule or censure. We talk over past days. We do not sigh for any pleasures beyond our humble habitation, the central point of all our joys." She quotes here William's poem An Evening Walk, which she had sent Jane previously, later in the letter adding Jane might see her friend placed in that happy habitation that is the little gilded cottage of the poem. Castles in the air become cottages in poems. In her next letter, she calls these "all my little schemes of felicity," and asks for Jane's assistance in painting scenes of happiness, happiness arising from the exercise of the social affections in retirement and rural quiet. She knows her schemes may all fall through, but she reminds Jane of when, as children, they used to imagine futures together. "You know in what vivid colours I can portray scenes of future felicity. You remember the enthusiasm with which we used to be fired when in the back kitchen, the croft, or in any other favourite of our haunts, we built our little tower of joy." In her next letter, Dorothy imagines Jane and William in her lonely landscape and employs them in the work of building towers of joy too. "I could almost fancy that I see you both near me. I have chosen a bank where I have room to spare for a resting place for each of you. I hear you point out a spot where, if we could erect a little cottage and call it our own, we should be the happiest of human beings. I see my brother fired with the idea of leading his sister to such a retreat as fancy, ever ready at our call, hastens to assist us in painting. Our parlour is in a moment furnished, our garden is adorned by magic, the roses and honeysuckles spring at our command, the woods behind the house lifts at once its head and furnishes us with a winter's shelter and a summer's noonday shade." Dorothy's journal shows the continuation of these homing fantasies even when they're living in Town End. On 19th May 1800, she declares an area of Easdale the most delightful situation possible for a cottage, and on the 28th of that month she walks up the rocks above Johnny Dockray's and daydreams of living there instead. "If I had £300 and could afford to have a bad interest for my money, I would buy that estate, and we would build a cottage there to end our days in." Not having £300, Dorothy goes into the garden, got white and yellow lilies, periwinkle, etc., to plant in her own garden and recreates the dream as best as possible. So we see then the shift from the imagined architecture of her childhood and youth to the botanical spaces of her later ones, whether domesticated gardens or wilderness of thought, as she writes of to Dora in spring 1838. In this letter, Dorothy's thoughts are a forest so deep and rich with life she might get lost in them and not return. The practice of these youthful imaginings, these towers of joy built up in greatest loneliness, are perhaps what enabled Dorothy to plant the gardens of the body-mind so vividly in her later years. It seems perhaps obvious, too, that Dorothy's extraordinary bodily and sensory attunement to the material world she meets, that feeds the distinctive descriptions of places and landscapes so prized by her readers, from William and S.T. Coleridge onwards, is inextricable from what allows her to travel and dwell so satisfactorily in and through her mind. I might go as far as to say the line between them is hazy and uncertain, and which locations are more or less real than the others is hard to determine. You can almost imagine one of Dorothy's beloved robins flitting easily from one to the other. Dream garden, real garden, dream cottage, real garden, sick room, body mind, poem. And that's where we're finishing. Thank you.